Good evening and welcome to our weekly Parsha class where we try to take just little tidbits or sparks of the Parsha to see some of what the Torah discusses from a little bit of a different angle than just the simple meaning of the text. And usually when we do that, it gives us a deeper appreciation for the Torah, and it also provides us with lessons that we could apply to our own lives. And in some cases, the lessons are obvious, and some you have to apply your mind to extract the lessons from it. The name of the parsha is Va'era, which means an eye appeared. God speaking to Moses. Moses complains to God. That was last week. Why did God send him to speak to Pharaoh when things got even worse? And God then says that you will see that I will take them out of Egypt and everything will be fine. That's more or less the gist of what it says in the end of last week's Torah portion. At the beginning of this week's Torah portion, God takes Moses to task. And he says, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And I didn't use the name that God introduces himself by in this context when he's talking to the Jewish people and taking them out of Egypt. The difference is that this name of God represents the God who is above and beyond nature. God revealed himself to Abraham within a more natural setting. And as the commentaries, starting with Rashi and others, explain that God was rebuking Moses for asking questions. And the Rebbe once explained that the difference between Moses and the patriarchs is the patriarchs were primarily spiritual, emotional giants. If you talk about emotions such as love, there's no one who loved God and other people more than Abraham. So Abraham personified love. Isaac personified gvura, strength, reverence, awe, submission of one's ego to something higher. Jacob personified the fusion of the two, compassion, truth, and so on and so forth. These were the traits of the patriarchs. Moses, on the other hand, personified divine intellect. He was the most receptive to divine intellect. He was an intellectual, a spiritual intellectual giant. So the truth is that how do you approach God when you're an emotional person? You don't ask questions because you have a deep emotional relationship with God, and if God does something, you still love him. It doesn't detract in any way from your emotions. But when you approach God with an intellectual approach, which is what Moses was all about, he was the supreme intellectual. Although most people, when they study the Torah, don't get the impression that Moses was an intellectual, he was the ultimate intellectual because he had divine knowledge in him, and intellect demands answers to questions. So then why was God upset with Moses? God was not really upset with Moses. God was saying to Moses, it's time that you graduate to an even higher level, that you also have the acceptance that comes from a pure, faith-based relationship with God that transcends knowledge, that Moses was now ready to go to an even higher level, because as high as you can go with divine intellect, you can go to an even higher level which transcends intellect. The word with which the Torah begins this parsha, the second verse actually, it's the first word, and the name of the parsha is Va'era, and I appeared. The Rebbe once pointed out a little bit of a hint here. The week in which we read this Torah portion is also the week in which we observe the passing of the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, who is the author of the famous classic Netanya. His name was Shneir, which means two lights, double light. That was the name that his father gave him at the behest of the Baal Shem Tov, who predicted that the Alter Rebbe would be a new soul, a new dimension of godliness coming into this world that would illuminate the world with two lights, the light of the revealed part of Torah. He wrote a code of Jewish law and brought it up to date, and the light of the inner part of Torah, and that is the teachings of Netanya and other works that he authored. And his name was fitting. Shnei or, two lights. Well, the word va'era has in it the word light, and also another letter, aleph, which is the initial of the word light. Two lights. But one is explicit and one is implicit. The revealed teachings of the Torah are accessible. They're something that everyone could relate to and understand. But then there's the mystical teachings of Torah that are esoteric. They're mysterious. We only get a little bit of the initials of those teachings. And they're all hinted in this very word, which reinforces an idea that was written by one of the great Kabbalists of 400 years ago, known as the Shalah, Rabbi Isaac Halevi Hurwitz, who writes in his commentary, in his classic work, that anytime we read a Torah portion around the time of some special event, a holiday or any special event, there's always going to be a connection between the two. So whatever portion we read around Rosh Hashanah, we'll find a connection to Rosh Hashanah, even though on the surface it doesn't seem to be talking about Rosh Hashanah. And likewise with this event, the passing of the Alter Rebbe, which occurred on the 24th of the month of Tevis this past week, is hinted in the name of this Parsha, which it coincides with. Well, God tells Moses that he is going to liberate the Jewish people. And God uses 4 expressions of redemption. He says, we'll follow the text inside if you want to follow. It's chapter 6, verse 6. Now, this is just one translation. There are various translations, but they more or less say the same thing. Therefore, God says to Moses, say to the children of Israel, I am God, and I shall take you out from under the burdens of Egypt. I shall rescue you from their service. I shall redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I shall take you to me for a people, and I shall be a God to you. And you shall know that I am God, your God, who takes you out of from under the burdens of Egypt. If you look at this series of verses, the Jerusalem Talmud notes there are 4 different expressions of redemption. I will take you out. That's one expression of redemption. The second one is, I shall redeem you. The second one is, I shall rescue you. The third one is, I shall redeem you. And the fourth one, I shall take you. Why are there 4 expressions? As we'll soon see, because there are really 4 dimensions of liberation. But before we go into those 4 dimensions, it's interesting, everyone knows what a Seder is. What do we do at the Seder? The enjoyable parts, of course. We drink 4 cups of wine. Why 4 cups of wine? Why not 3? Why not 5? 6? Because the Talmud says there are 4 expressions of redemption in this section. God describes the Exodus by using 4 different terms. So for each term, we drink another cup of wine. Well, what is the reason why we have 4 expressions of redemption? I mean, the answer to the question why we drink 4 cups of wine is because we have 4 expressions of redemption. But why 4 expressions of redemption? Couldn't you just say it in one word? I will liberate you, and that would be good enough. Well, if you just think about it, this is a simple explanation. There were really 4 stages there. Stage number 1, what were the Jews doing in Egypt? They were slaves, but not just slaves, that they had no freedom. They were tortured. They were beaten. They were massacred. Most people don't know this, but slavery is a horrible thing in any form, in any shape. But especially when Egyptians would take little babies, and when they didn't have enough mortar for the bricks, they would crush the little babies into the mortar for the bricks. So they tortured the Jewish people, murdered their children, and of course beat them mercilessly. The first step of liberation is to remove the torture, the pain, the suffering that they were enduring, that were visited upon them. That's the first type of freedom. The next level of freedom is they were freed from being slaves. Because you could be a slave, it's not tortured, your master is very nice to you, but he doesn't let you be free. That's also a form of suffering and pain. It's more psychological than it is physical. God took us out of that as well. Actually, when did the Jews stop working? The Talmud says a half year before the Exodus. Rosh Hashanah is the anniversary of the Jewish people's freedom from slavery. Although they were still in Egypt, and they were still, in a sense, not able to leave Egypt, they were no longer required to do any work because the Egyptians were busy nursing their wounds from the 10 plagues, which started about a year earlier. But that still didn't mean that they were free because they were still locked up in Egypt. They couldn't leave the country. Reminds us of the Jews in the Soviet Union. Even if the Jew was not persecuted and oppressed, the fact that he couldn't leave Soviet Union to go to the land of Israel to be free from and live wherever he wants, that was also a form of slavery, form of deprivation of freedom, and they were freed from that as well. They were allowed to leave Egypt. So those are three different levels of freedom: free from torture, free from slavery, and free to emigrate. So what's the fourth one? The fourth one is the most important. God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai. He took us to him as a nation. And this is the most important lesson, I think, for the modern times. People talk about freeing people from slavery, from oppression. That's wonderful. But if you don't give them a message, if you don't give them purpose in life, if you don't give them a mission, their freedom is not really freedom. Because what happens to human beings, you just go from one master to another. You're free, so you become addicted to drugs or to whatever else that people are addicted to. Then you're still a slave, but you're a slave to something else. It's external pressures that control you. If it's not addiction to drugs, then it's workaholism. If it's not that, it's some other form of slavery. When you have a purpose in life and you have a mission that God gives you, that's the most liberating thing that a human being can endure, because then you become God's servant. You have one master. If you don't have God as your master, you have multiple masters. From nations. God tells us we have to be servants. He gives us the great we possibly enjoy. Those are the four different stages of liberation. There's actually a fifth expression here. In the next verse, in verse 8 rather, it says, "And I shall bring you to the land about which I raised my hand to give it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." That's not counted. Some say that there's an opinion that says you should drink a fifth cup on the Seder night. Not too many people will quarrel with that, but we don't drink a fifth cup, but we do pour a fifth cup for Elijah. And some say that the reason for that is because the fifth cup is about coming to the land. That refers to the Messianic age, to the future. So we don't have the ability to drink that cup, because drinking it means we already experienced that. We didn't experience that yet. Even though we have access to Israel, Israel is independent and so on and so forth, it's still not the Israel that was foreseen by the prophets, where we'd be totally spiritually free. This would be a utopia. And therefore, the fifth cup, the Gaon of Vilna says, we designate for Elijah, who's the one who will announce the future redemption. As if to say, yes, there's a fifth expression, a fifth cup, but not yet. We're waiting for Elijah to announce Mashiach, the Messiah, is here and takes us all to Israel in a state of total freedom, total spiritual freedom. The Rebbe's father showed that the expressions of redemption correspond to the different holidays. There's an expression that corresponds to Pesach, the Passover. There's one about saving, rescuing. The root of the word is tzeil, which means shade. That corresponds to the holiday of Sukkot, where we sit in the shade of the Sukkah. Taking you to me as a nation refers to Shavuos, when God gave us the Torah. And saving you is about the holiday of Purim, when we were threatened with annihilation, and God saved us from annihilation. But then the fifth expression is about Tisha B'Av, and it has the word in Hebrew, Vehevesi, in verse 8, has the letter Tav, which stands for Tisha, 9, and the word Av, the month of Av. That the fifth expression corresponds to the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, which will become the greatest holiday, the most joyous day in the Jewish calendar, because that's the day when the saddest day will be transformed into a joyous day. The saddest day, because of the destruction of the two temples and the ensuing exile, will become the source of great joy when Mashiach comes and ushers in the future and final redemption. So all holidays are accounted for over here. All biblical holidays are accounted for. You know, 4 is a very popular number in the Torah. The Seder, night of Passover, we have 4 cups of wine, corresponding to the 4 expressions of redemption. How many questions do we ask? You guessed right, 4. How many sons come to the Seder? 4. And there are a few other 4s as well. Why is 4 so popular? Well, the answer is because God used 4 expressions. But 4 is also the number of letters of God's name. And God's name is the energy through which God channels his presence into this world. And it goes through 4 different stages. So everything, we're not going to go into it right now, but the Kabbalists point out that every transmission of energy from one entity to another, whether it's in the process of teaching, whether it's in the process of procreation, whether it's in the process of a spiritual development, it goes through 4 stages. Just to give you an example, when it comes to charity, here's a poor person who's saying, I need money to purchase food. So what do you do first? The first you put your hands in your pocket and you take out a coin. A coin is like the letter Yud, first letter of God's name. You put the coin in your hand, which has 5, spread out, and has 5 fingers. That's the letter Hey of God's name. Hey is an expansive letter, and it also is the number 5. Then what do? You stretch out your arm. That corresponds to the Vav, the 3rd letter of God's name, and you put it in the hands of the poor man, which is, again, another Hey, spelling out God's name. But it goes deeper than that. The first stage in the development of an idea, whether it's an intellectual idea, whether it's an emotional response to something, like helping a poor person, is the first thing you have to do is you have to contract yourself. Because you can't, let's talk about helping someone. You can't help a poor person if you're preoccupied with yourself. So you have to reduce yourself, your selfness, your ego, and you turn it into a little Yud, suppressed Yud. Then you can go out and help someone because you're no longer into your own full sense of who you are, which would be a conflict with getting to help someone else. You have to allow that other person into your life. So the first thing you have to do is become a Yud, the letter that's like a little dot. But then you can't help someone if you're a nobody, and nobodies don't help anybody's. You then have to develop a pattern, a system, a structure, how to help the other person. You know, it could be as simple taking out money from your pocket, or it could be finding a job for the other person. It could be saying a few words of comfort. You have to devise a way, how am I going to help the other person? That's the Hey. That's expansive. Hey stands for thought, speech, and action. You develop a whole system in your mind. But when you develop in your mind, that's theoretical. You then have to do the act. Give it. Stretch out and transmit whatever it is that you have to the other person. And the other person has to receive it. If the other person doesn't receive your help, you haven't helped them. If you want to give someone food and they don't take it, they're still going to go hungry. So they're an integral part of the process. And the same thing is true with teaching. A teacher has knowledge that's way beyond the level of the student, so the teacher has to contract his knowledge into a little Yud. Then the teacher has to develop a whole lecture based on that Yud. and then he has to transmit it, and the student has to absorb it. That's more or less the idea, that everything consists of four. But that's a very deep concept, and we're only doing the sparks over here. We're not going into very great length. Okay, so God tells Moses that he should tell the Jewish people about the imminent redemption. And it says, and if you go to verse 9, and Moses spoke accordingly to the children of Israel, but they did not heed Moses because of shortness of breath and hard work. They did not listen. I mean, you can't blame them. They were incapable of listening. So then God says in verse 11, go speak to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, that he send the children of Israel from his land. And Moses argues with God, which is typical for Moses. And Moses says, no, how could that be? Behold, the children of Israel have not listened to me, so how will Pharaoh listen to me? And I have sealed lips. Moses had a speech impediment. So Moses is using a logical argument. Moses is the man of logic, remember. What is he saying? The people didn't listen to me. The Jewish people didn't listen to me. Is Pharaoh going to listen to me? This is called in Talmudic jargon, kal v'chomer, minor and major, deducing a major from a minor. A simple example of that would be that if you would be considered a criminal if you steal $1, then how much more so if you steal $1,000? That's deducing a major from a minor. That's what he's doing here. If the Jews didn't listen, how do you expect Pharaoh to listen? So the commentaries ask, the Torah tells us why the Jews didn't listen, because they were slaves. Mm-hmm. They had shortness of breath. They can hardly breathe. Shortness of breath and hard work. That's the reason that they didn't listen. Pharaoh didn't have that problem, so why is it so compelling logic that Pharaoh would not listen? So the simple answer is, when someone is in pain, and someone comes to you and says, I can get you out of this pain, you would listen. When do people not listen? When people have it good, when people don't have the pain and the suffering. You know, there's a famous joke of the guy who's looking for a parking space for a very important meeting, and it's getting late, and he can't miss this meeting. It's very crucial. And he says to good God, if you get me a parking space, I'll give you $10,000. And he still can't find one. He multiplies that 20,000, 50,000. And at the last second, someone pulls out right in front of the door, and he pulls right in and says, God, I took care of it myself. When things go well, we forget about God. When things are not going well, then we begin to pray and depend on God. So the Jewish people here, things were not going well for them. Things were horrible. They should have been very receptive to God's message. The question is, Moses performed miracles to the Jewish people. God predicted that they will listen to Moses. They will believe. And that's what happened initially. But when things started to go downhill, they didn't listen anymore. What happened to God's promise that the people will believe and will listen? So one of the commentaries explains, based on Maimonides' analysis of faith. There are two kinds of faith. There's faith that's based on miracles. You see a miracle happening, it excites you, but as soon as the effects wear off and you don't see the miracle, the faith also wears off. When did we get true faith? At Mount Sinai. Because then, at Mount Sinai, Maimonides uses this term, our ears heard and our eyes saw. We didn't have to rely on a miracle. We visualized and heard God speak, and we saw with our mind's eye the presence of God and experienced it. It was not a miracle, and that is something that never changes. From that point onward, Every Jew has an internal mechanism and faith in God. Now, we know a lot of people who don't have faith in God. That's not their true nature. Their true nature is that they have that faith that was implanted in us at Mount Sinai. Before miracles, sure, you'll be impressed and you'll follow the person who performs the miracles and believe in everything he says until the moment that the miracles stop happening, until you see a reversal. With the story how Moses is speaking to Pharaoh, it gives you a little genealogy. And it tells you about the family, Moses' family, and about Aaron. That Aaron married a woman by the name of Elisheva. If you want to know who Elisheva is, she's the sister of Nachshon. Why is that important? The Torah really tells you who someone's wife is. Torah really tells you who someone's wife is, and certainly not who someone's sister is. So the Talmud says, from this we derive that when a person wants to marry someone, always look at the woman's brothers. The brothers will tell you something about your future wife. The simple explanation is, if the brothers are nice people, that means the family is a nice family. But why not look at the woman herself? Well, this is one of the politically incorrect concepts in Judaism, that women, in terms of modesty, do not flaunt their qualities. They're very private and humble. Men flaunt their capabilities. You see it. Even if they don't try to show off, they are always trying to be in the public eye. And they do it subconsciously, not just consciously. So if you want to know about a certain woman, you can't always look at her because there's much more that's within her, which is her real essence, more so than the men. So you look at her brothers at least. That's my politically incorrect contribution for tonight. Then the Torah talks about Moses and Aaron, and it alternates between, this is in verse 26, who Aaron and Moshe. This is Aaron and Moses. And Rashi comments that in some places it puts Aaron's name before Moses, as it does here. In some places it put Moses' name first. In most places. Now, why would they reverse the order? So Rashi says, and this is a method of interpreting the Torah. When the Torah changes the order, sometimes it puts things in one order, sometimes in another order. It's to tell you they're both equal. That Aaron and Moses were equal in greatness. That's how Rashi explains it. What does that mean they were equal? Moses was the person chosen by God, not Aaron. Aaron was Moses' deputy. So in Hasidic philosophy, it explains, based on Kabbalah, that Moses and Aaron were both the greatest in each of their respective roles. Whenever you have a relationship, a marriage, let's say, which is the model that we use for our relationship with God. At Mount Sinai, God was the bridegroom, we are the bride, and we came together in marriage. And the Exodus was a prelude to the marriage that occurred at Mount Sinai. Whenever there's a marriage between two people, the two people are essentially starting off as strangers. They're not related to each other. And there's a certain amount of hesitation that the bridegroom has before the wedding. He's a little nervous. He's getting into a relationship. And the bride is a little nervous. So they need an escort. And that's the Jewish custom. I think it's also in non-Jewish traditions, where you have relatives, parents usually, escorting the bridegroom to the marriage ceremony and escorting, someone else escorts the bride. We have two people, parents usually, escort the bridegroom and parents escorting the bride. Some places the custom is the father of the bride and the bridegroom escort the groom, and the father and the mother of the bride and the mother of the bridegroom escort the bride. Or sometimes it's the parents. Whatever it is, you need to have an escort. That's because that's the way it is with God and us. There's a certain hesitation that God has to want to relate to us, because after all, we know who we are. We know how fragile we are. We know how frail we are. We know how limited and finite we are. And God is infinite in everything. So for God to come down to us, God chooses Moses to be his escort. He is the escort of the king. It's also a matter of honor to show that the king doesn't come by himself. But we also need an escort. Aaron is the escort of the queen, of the bride. So who is greater? Depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about who brings God to the people, Moses brings God to the people. Moses brought the Torah down from Mount Sinai, from on high down to us. Who cultivates the people and warms them up and shows them love and prepares them and softens them to be receptive to the Torah? That's Aaron's job. Aaron was the most loving person. Aaron was the one who pursued peace and was always in the forefront of bringing people together and making them receptive to the Torah. So yes, Moshe is the greatest and Aaron is the greatest, both each in their respective roles. Then we get to the fun part of this parsha, for at least for us, but not for the Egyptians, the 10 plagues. That's closer to the end of the parsha. There's a lot more that we skip, but this is only little sparks, so we're going to skip over to the 10 plagues. What is the significance of 10 plagues? The question has been asked by many people, and commentators have asked this question already many times before, in the past. Why did God have to bring 10 plagues to get Pharaoh to let the Jews go? God could have just made them, liberated them. He could have put Pharaoh to sleep, and everyone just leaves, and that's the end of it. If he had to punish Pharaoh, why did he have to go through 10 plagues? And then God says, I'm going to harden his heart so that he won't even have a choice. What's going on over here? So first of all, the 10 plagues were punishment for all of the terrible torture inflicted upon Israel by the Egyptians. Then why did God harden Pharaoh's heart? So the Maimonides explains that that's part of the punishment. When you do evil and repeat it over and over, your punishment is that you lose your ability to stop doing evil. And at that point, you cause your own destruction. That's the threat that a person who's ready to do evil has to recognize. When someone is out to harm someone, he has to know, you know what? I might think it's a one-time thing, and I will never do it again. It's not a one-time thing. You might do it again, and then you won't be able to control yourself even if you want to stop. That is the threat, the deterrent for people who do evil, that they won't be able to get out of it. Because most people who start don't think of their lives as, I'm going to become a criminal for life. They think of it, I have to do this one-time thing, I need the money and whatever it is, but then it will lead inevitably, inexorably to something that's irreversible. That's one approach to the 10 plagues. A mystical approach to the 10 plagues is that when God created the world, it says he used 10 utterances, 10 statements. When God gave us the Torah, 10 commandments, also 10 statements. God's 10 statements in the world is concealed. There's a crust that doesn't let us see the divine in everything. When you look at a table, you see a table. When you look at the house, you see a house. You look at the earth, you see earth. But there's God's energy in everything. That's what 10 utterances are. But we don't see it. The 10 commandments is where you see God's commandments. What was the medium through which the 10 statements were converted into 10 commandments? The 10 plagues. The 10 plagues remove the crust, remove the layer of concealment that doesn't allow us to see the divine, and enabled God to reveal the 10 commandments to us. So that's a little bit of a deeper understanding that these 10 plagues were really 10 instruments to remove the blockage that exists in terms of God's inability to express himself in this world. The 10 plagues removed the blockages.
Is there a connection to the Sephirot?
Yes. They
So
all start with the 10 Sephirot, the 10 divine attributes, which manifest themselves in many different ways. Now, the 10 plagues, a third way of looking at it, somewhere in between these other two approaches of punishment and removing the barriers to God's 10 commandments, is that these are 10 educational steps. That seems to be Rashi's approach. Blood. The water turned into blood. Why did God, and the second plague was the frogs came out of the Nile. What is the significance of these two plagues? So Rashi says the first thing that God does when he wants to punish a nation, he punishes their gods, their idols. What was the idol of Egypt? The Nile. The Egyptians had many idols. But what did they worship first and foremost? The Nile, because without the Nile they couldn't have survived. The Nile provided them with all their food. So they worshiped the Nile. So what does God do? He says, you worship the Nile is useless. He turned it into blood.
But not mud.
Not mud?
Why blood?
Oh, that's a good question. Why blood? Well, there are several explanations. One explanation is that blood is a symbol of something that is full of heat and energy. And God was demonstrating the evil energy of Egypt. That if you want to get out of Egypt, you have to counter the passion, the blood, the boiling blood, the passion that goes along with living in a exile-oriented type of life. I think there's another way of looking at it. What is the symbol of life of a human being, of an animal? Blood. Yet the Nile turned into blood and it was useless.
Mm-hmm.
Tell you that nothing that gives you life has the power to give you life on its own. It's the divine that gives you the ability to enjoy the life-sustaining powers of the Nile. Just like the blood, if the blood is in a river, it doesn't help you. It has to be in your body. There's a context for everything. Now, let's take this idea that God strikes the idols first. The first step in undermining the Egyptian exile mentality is to show that the idols, and we have idols today as well, our idols today are our mindsets. Our secular mindset is just as much an idol as a stone statue that people in primitive times would bow down to, thinking that that was God. We worship, when I say we, I mean society, Western culture, worships and glorifies science. It worships and glorifies art, philosophy, human logic, and they're all positive things. They could, at least some of them, are certainly partially positive. We do believe very much in pursuing truth in nature and everything, but to glorify it. The people who believe in, I'll give you an example. A colleague of mine had an argument with an atheist, and when he challenged him, he says, well, how did the first thing come about that was responsible for the Big Bang? Who banged it? Who allowed it to happen? And this atheist response was, we do not know now, but I believe that a day will come, the scientists will figure that out. And my colleague caught him on the spot and says, "You said, what did you say? I believe? Oh, you have faith? In what? In scientists? There's no guarantee. There's no basis for that faith. Especially now when any scientist worth his money will admit that we know much less now than we ever knew before, because there's so much more to know that we don't know. So as we progress, we discover there's much more that we don't know. The God of Egypt is not really God. the Nile is worthless. That's not enough. To destroy an idol, it's not enough to intellectually destroy it. You have to be disgusted with it to really destroy it. That's what the second plague was, frogs. When the frogs started coming out of the Nile and entering their homes, into their ovens, into their food supply, into everything, and they realized that it came from the Nile, they were now repulsed by the Nile. So you can intellectually know that a certain ideology is worthless, but there's a point where it becomes repulsive. For example, in 1920, in 1910, if someone would read Nazi ideology, he would convincingly be able to argue how wrong and how evil it is. But in the 1940s, you don't need the intellectual argument against it. You're repulsed by it because of how evil, how disgusting, how repugnant, how evil it was. So your emotions rejected it. The first plague got us to reject idol worship intellectually. An idol doesn't have any value. It's blood. It can't do anything. The second plague made us reject it emotionally. Then we get to the third plague, lice. We're not going to do all the plagues, but we'll do some of them. Lice. After the first plague, the Egyptians were undeterred. The sorcerers did the same thing. They can also turn water into blood. They can get frogs coming out of the Nile, just like a magician could get a rabbit out of a hat. But the third plague, they said, this is the finger of God. Why? So Rashi explains, because the sorcerers cannot work with something smaller than a barley bean. And the lice are so small that they realized their magic couldn't reproduce that, couldn't replicate the lice. So they said, a finger of God. But what is the lesson there? The lesson is that secular and pagan, and secular could be pagan, ideology doesn't recognize small things. Mm-hmm. In our society, anything that is small is insignificant. Anything big has value. The small people are insignificant. Small actions are insignificant. What's the big deal giving, a few cents to charity? Why should I care about it? Every mitzvah has infinite value. There's no such thing as something too small. You're an idolater, small things don't rate. You're a believer in God, God says even the small things rate. And just a little bit of a philosophy, people sometimes ask, why would God care what I do in the privacy of my home? Why would he care about a little gesture of kindness? God is so big. The answer is, and if I told you that the whole universe is as insignificant to God as my little finger, would that tell you that the universe is worthless? Yes, the universe is worthless, but one little act of kindness has infinite value because God chose it to have infinite value. That becomes divine. The universe, the way it is finite. Finite versus infinite is zero. Has no value. One little act of kindness, to pick on an example, has infinite value because it's God's will. And just to take this one step further, if you're a billionaire and you talk about someone who has $100, you won't even bother with it. It just doesn't rate, because 100 relative to a billion has relative value, and it's just so insignificant. But when you're infinite, big and small are equal. And just as small has no significance, big also has no significance. But if God chose that it has significance, which he did, it is infinite. So one little mitzvah has more value than the whole universe. And that's the lesson from the lice. Yes, you're a pagan, you're a secularist, little things don't count. You're a believer in God, and you believe in God's teachings, every little detail counts. The next plague was a mixture of wild animals. If you go to chapter 8. And this is starting with verse 16 and verse 17. If you do not send out my people, behold, I shall incite against you, your servants, your people, and your houses, the swarm of wild beasts. And the houses of Egypt shall be filled with a swarm, and even the ground upon which they are. And on that day I shall set apart the land of Goshen upon which my people stands, that there shall be no swarm there. So what happens over here? There's a mixture of wild animals coming together to terrorize the Egyptian people. And here God says there will not be any in the land of Goshen. Now, does it say that about blood and frogs and lice? That there was no blood or frogs or lice in the land of Goshen? It doesn't say that. Check the verses before. Nowhere does it say that these plagues only affected the Egyptians. It doesn't say that it didn't affect everyone else. Well, that's what we assume, that it only affected the Egyptians, but it doesn't say that clearly. And that's why there are some commentaries who say that the first 3 plagues did affect the Egyptians, the Israelites, not just the Egyptians. Right. So, and even if it didn't apply to them, the Torah doesn't make that point until the 4th plague. So why is it that the 4th plague, the Torah emphasizes there was a separation between the Egyptians and the Israelites? So the Rebbe once explained that in this world we have 2 dynamics. We have the dynamic of synthesis and separation. There are things that we want them separated. You have 2 chemicals. You don't want them together. You create an explosion. You want them separated. There are things that we want them together. Hydrogen and oxygen. If you put 2 of hydrogen and 1 oxygen, you get water. You can't live without it. You want the synthesis. You want the things to be together. So there are times when unity is the desired result, and sometimes it's separation that is desired. And very often we get these 2 things confused. Very often the things that should be in our lives, that should be together, we separate. The things that we should separate, we put together. In Judaism, there's many different areas of separation. There are different classes. Let's say we have Kohen, Levi, Israel. The Kohen has his role. A Israelite or a Levi is not allowed to do the things that the Kohen does, serve in the temple. There's differences between men and women, although today that's politically incorrect, but we still have a right to maintain that men and women are different, not just biologically, but also spiritually, and they have different roles. There are many things in which they share, but there are differences. There are all sorts of separations in this world that are legitimate and are desirable, and there are all sorts of things that should not be separated. People should be together, and things should be united. There's always a danger when you focus on mixing things together that it could lead to improper mixtures. So at this point where God takes all these animals that are usually separated from each other and puts them together, God says, I have to make a point of showing that there's a need of separation. When you put things together, don't lose sight of what you have to separate. When you separate, don't forget about what you have to put together. I'll give you an example. You know, each of us has his or her own home, and we're supposed to, you know, we're allowed to have our own privacy. Torah says the 10th commandment is don't covet, don't be jealous of what someone else has. So each person has his or her own territory. Animals are very territorial. But we're also supposed to not be obsessed with our own territory. We're supposed to open our doors to the stranger, to the poor person, and we're supposed to go out and share with what we have with others. But one second, didn't the Torah say each one of us has our boundaries? Yes, we have boundaries and borders, and we have to protect them. but we also have to open the doors. And I don't want to get into the politics of borders and doors, but there's no question that Torah says you have to respect boundaries, but you also have to have open doors and gates where things come together. When people are obsessed with boundaries of separation, they forget about unity. When people are obsessed with unity, they forget about boundaries. And that's what the Torah is saying. When we're talking about unity, all animals together, we focus on the separation. Now, if you look through the whole section over here, only 7 plagues are mentioned, 7 of the 10. The other 3 are first mentioned in next week's Torah portion. Now, one way of explaining that is, you mentioned before the 10 sephiros, the 10 divine attributes. We also possess 10 faculties. Of those 10 faculties, 3 are intellectual, chachma, bina, and das, and 7 emotional. When we're attacking Egypt, we're attacking a unholy, unsavory influence. Egypt is not just a historical nation. The word in Hebrew for Egypt, Mitzrayim, means that which constricts us, that which inhibits us, that which imprisons us. And to get out of prison, get out of exile, we have to focus on 2 different aspects of our personality. You have to attack the emotional aspects of our personality, and you have to then address the intellectual. You have to first deal with the emotional. If you see a child hitting another child, bullying another child, that's an emotional thing. You're not going to start philosophizing with a child, explaining why it's wrong, because the child is not receptive to philosophy. You have to use your emotions, you have to use your feelings to convey the feelings of what it is to be hurt and what it is wrong about harming someone. But when the child grows older, you educate the child to understand that what the child was doing was wrong, or what it is that the child should be doing that is right. So we first start off with attacking the emotional negativity of Egypt, and then next week we graduate to the next level. We start to focus on the mindset, the Egyptian mentality and mindset, and how we could affect those as well. So we'll talk more about the 3 intellectual next week. But for now, the focus here is on the emotional. Just another point about the fact that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Then the question is asked, then how can God punish someone if God hardens his heart? And I mentioned one answer, Maimonides, that the hardening of his heart was actually the punishment for doing all the evil. Another answer to the question the Rebbe gives is that Pharaoh did not lose his free choice. No human being ever loses free choice. The difference is what difficulty you will have in exercising your free choice. If I find a child who grows up in a ghetto, in a place where there's violence all around him, doesn't have any positive role models, what do I expect of that child? What do I think is the probable outcome? The child will grow into a criminal, a violent person. But is that guaranteed? Is it not possible for that child to break out of that mold? It is possible. The child has free choice. It's improbable, but it's not impossible. So when God hardens your heart, what he's doing, he's making your choices more difficult to exercise. But you always have free choice.
Is he making them more emotional? It would seem to be logical that in the spirit of the 7 being emotions, hardening the heart would mean it's not a rational thing that the Pharaoh is.
Yes, he is making it emotionally difficult for him to...
Stoking his emotions,
right.
Making him angry, making
There are people who can't get themselves to part with their money. They know they should, but they just can't. Emotionally, they're incapable. People are incapable of expressing themselves. They're They don't know how to communicate. They have a blockage. It doesn't mean they can't do it. It means they have a major challenge. So Pharaoh was given this ultimate challenge. Do you have the power to break out of this mold of your hardening of your heart? And he failed. If we were betting on it, we would have won the bet that he was going to fail, but no guarantee. There was still some possibility that he would have not failed. You often see that. I should rephrase that. You see this from time to time. How some of the most evil people that we could think of as being evil have been rehabilitated. I just want to mention this a few days ago. There's a leader of one of the right-wing, extreme right-wing anti-Semitic parties in Hungary, second in command of it, who was a Holocaust denier and an anti-Semite, went all over Europe preaching this hatred until he discovered that his mother's mother was a Holocaust survivor, a Jew. And it was the shock of his life. It was traumatic. But you know what happened in the end? He became an observant Jew. He was rejected, of course, by his colleagues when the moment they found out he was Jewish. And he started to learn about Judaism, and I think the latest is that he made Aliyah to Israel, and his wife converted to Judaism. And if I would have to bet on it, I would have bet 1,000 to 1 that this man is evil, he'll never change. But he did. So you can never really say that this person is never going to change. And there's a final third answer, although there's more than 3, that being a hard heart, being stiff-necked, can go both ways. We're also a stiff-necked people, and sometimes that stood us in good stead. The reason why we're around today is because we're a stubborn people. We don't throw in the towel. We don't give up. So Pharaoh was given the same Jewish trait that all Jews have. We're stubborn people. He could have used his stubbornness and said, I know my people don't want the Jews to leave because it's going to hurt our economy and we want them to be slaves and this. But I'm going to go against everything and all my people, and I'm going to do what is right. So he could have used his hard heart on the other way, in the other direction, and he chose not to, so that's why he's faulted. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
We'll be back, God willing, next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. Thank you.
Any more soup? I just got a little. You have some?
Soup?